The humanized internet, when you think about the humanized internet, it is around some stuff that I'm going to be talking about. And let me just frame it on a very, very personal level. About a year ago in February, I had a chance to visit a refugee center in Berlin, the refugee center in Berlin. And it was a technical meetup. Actually, this happened in February. And it was interesting to hear the stories of the people who had made it across what you've seen on television, across the several countries that they traversed to make it into Berlin. And when you're in a refugee center in Berlin, what you're doing basically is learning German and you're coding. And so we talked about sets of identities and what that meant and what was very concerning about people. So we're going to talk about digital identity in this conversation. If I fast forward, in May of 2016, and May 20th, I had a chance to present at the UN at the ID 2020 Summit. And that was this whole notion of what is happening with digital identity and the provenance of identity and what happens when you don't have it. So I think it's really important to talk about that humanization, if you will, factor. So the problem space, if we take it at a very fundamental level, 1.5 billion people do not have identity. And if you think about it, you came into this room, you came into the center with an identity, correct? You had an identity. You have a passport, you have a social security number, you have an attestation of your university degree, but if you don't have an affirmation of your identity or provenance of your identity, you are excluded. You are absolutely excluded. And 1.5 billion people is quite a lot. And if you think about children under that age, around 230 million children don't have identity either. So the implication is that they are actually set up as potential victims of sex trafficking. And that's a really big issue, as well as women. So when you go into these camps at the UN, by the way, there's a lot of great work being done today. It's all fragmented, but it's being done today in this space of digital identity. What happens is that families are separate and children are separate. And so they don't know, where their parents are, and sometimes these children are taken in by some of the families to inflate the family for privileges in the camps itself. But that's one side of the coin on this notion of digital identity. What happens, for example, if there is a natural disaster and you don't have provenance of who you are, right? You don't have provenance of your birth certificate, and you don't have this notion of persistence. So could we not think about creating an opportunity where people could leapfrog all of this paperwork and absolutely use this notion of digital? I think this is a really important situation and opportunity to assess. Most people have, that we have discovered in talking with my colleagues, and most of them have a phone. Maybe fundamental, but a phone. You would be surprised that some of them are actually Facebook users. So there's a social media presence in terms of the sets of identities that we talk about. So that is kind of the opportunity here in terms of having what we call, or the problem, if you will, of what persistence and provenance can and should look like. You know, the humanization, because we're talking about the internet per se, the humanization, the mission here, when we take a look at what that humanized internet can and should look like, is thinking about providing a persistent digital identity for 1.5 billion people. But the real opportunity here, ladies and gentlemen, is looking about how we provide ourselves within this notion of digital identity. And when we say digital identity, we mean identity, that which you choose to share. This is the difference. We have different types of identities. You have a professional identity, you have a home identity, you have all kinds of identity. But when we start at the most vulnerable, those who are identity-less, is an area that I think is a very big, hairy problem to look at. And by the way, there's going to be a lot of hairy problems that I'm going to be describing in the next couple of minutes. So that's one area. And I think at the UN last year, they showed a horrific film, a documentary on the story of Meena, who was a 9-year-old girl out of India, and she was sold to a brothel. And by the time she was 14 or 15, she had a couple of children. And it was what was the future of those children. And the story of Meena is she couldn't prove, she was actually rescued by an NGO. She couldn't prove who the father was by the law, and those children still remain in the brothel. So that's kind of the background. And the vision is to actually look at that persistence, because if we can unlock the power, if you will, of that humanization of the internet, we can actually provide and leapfrog this paperless, this paper stuff that we're dealing with today. We have a passport that's paper, et cetera, and think about providing persistence and provenance at a digital level, which is really the great opportunity and vision. You know, the value proposition, if you think about that middle identity, is this is my name. But it's more than this is my name. It's the value that I get. Can you imagine a billion moments of safety? One of the refugees I spoke with actually made the walk, but he made a walk with a colleague who had diabetes. So he couldn't get his insulin. What about the happiness of fairness and all of the billion people types of problems that we can look at when we think about healthcare? A lot of issues around healthcare today that are very, very problematic. And we have to put that together in terms of what that holistic, if you will, value proposition can and should look like. The access to technology, the access to clean water, all of that together at a very, very fundamental level, because this is what they were looking for at that time. And this is what they look for as children who may be separated. I think this is a horrific problem. And I think with billion people problems, I think it's really cool to look at that. So the traits, if you will, or the factors behind the humanized internet include this notion of humanness and well-being. So I'm talking about the tenets here and that which is underpinning the value proposition. This notion of increased participation. Education, for example, is a very, very key issue. And of course, it's all about your liberty. And if you think about liberties, and you think about the principle behind digital identity, you can see that we're talking about that which you own. This is my name, that which I choose to share. And just as a side note, as an experiment, actually, I'm actually going to pick up an e-residency card in Estonia. So that provides me capability to go through EU or EU countries with just a digital e-residency card. You can do that for 100 euros as an FYI. So these are things that I think become very, very interesting in terms of digital identity and the traits for that humanized internet. The freedom and opportunity for all, that I think the most important notion here is the notion of purposeful. The big technical opportunity, and not easy, is looking at how we choose to share identity. And by the way, some of the people, whether you're literate or illiterate, in terms of a trusted digital lockbox, that which can be transient at any point in time, no central authority is holding it. I think this is the tricky part. You can actually have that attestation of provenance and it disappears. And this is a very, very hard problem to look at. So you can see the factors that go behind that notion of identity and what a digital lockbox that is transient can look like, and a federated lockbox in itself. If we double-click further, I think that, go back a bit, the architecture at a very, very high level is around trusted digital identities, and there's shadowed identities, and there's root identities. There may be portions of biometrics that you're sharing. And today, biometrics, we share biometrics by way of thumbprinting in camps. It's thumbprinting and retinal scans. It may be even some notion of DNA swathing. For example, if children disappear or separate. But you can see that here you're talking about these digital lock boxes. And the hard problem here is if we're looking at ciphers, we're looking at very difficult problems to look at. And I think this is very, very interesting in itself. What would that be if you do not, by philosophy, not want to store to any central entity? If you talk to some of these people who have been impacted, they were very scared that some central entity was going to own them. So it's the big challenge of looking at what that can be at an architectural level. And that's a very hard problem, by the way, that we're thinking about. You know, what can that be? That not any central, I'm choosing to share. I'm choosing to share at any point in time, this is my name, what that can be. And so I think there, you know, whether it's a shadow ID or levels of identity, I think become very, very interesting in themselves. Building a humanized internet is solving a billion people problem, ladies and gentlemen. A billion people problem, and what better way to do that at an exponential level? Because then we're going to start thinking about gender equality. We're going to talk about, you know, what that notion of privacy, which has been a big part of my conversation with you today, can look like. Access to clean water, as I've stated before, access to health care, which I've asserted, and also education. I think this is really very, very key, because if you do not have the identity, you have no right to go to school. So this is, you know, if you take it at its holistic level, it becomes that big opportunity at the end of the day. The world, ladies and gentlemen, is exploding with great potential, and, you know, I've just kind of highlighted a bit of the problem space. The world today is beta. I'm working with wonderful people. We need you, and there's great work going on in this space, which I think is a fantastic opportunity to step up and think about what we're going to be doing together in terms of digital identity. And ask yourself one question: why is it that you have multiple ID cards? Why is it? Could we not have one, and one that we choose to at any point in time, share at any point in time? I think that's the opportunity. Contact us, because this is about the beginning of a journey. It's the humanized internet. It's for you all. Thank you.